It is the dead of night in Jerusalem, roughly 957 years before the birth of Christ. On the summit of Mount Moriah, something is happening that defies every law of the ancient world. A temple, the most ambitious structure ever conceived by a king of Israel, is rising from the bedrock, block by block, column by column, wall by colossal wall. But there is no sound of hammering, no clang of chisel against limestone, no iron scraping across cedar beams. The Book of Kings tells us plainly, and it has puzzled scholars for 3,000 years, that no hammer, no axe, no tool of iron was heard in the temple while it was being built. Think about that. A structure of white limestone and Lebanese cedar, spanning over 180 feet in length, gold-plated walls, floors overlaid with cypress, cherubim carved from olive wood, standing 15 feet tall, their wings touching wall to wall, and not a single hammer blow was heard during its construction. How? The canonical scriptures offer silence on the matter. The rabbinical traditions offer only whispers. But there exists a text, ancient, suppressed, and deeply feared, that does not whisper, it screams. It is called the Testament of Solomon, and according to its pages, the first temple of Jerusalem was not built by human hands alone. It was built by demons. Entities pulled from the spaces between worlds, fallen beings, ancient spirits, desert horrors older than the Torah itself, bound, chained, and enslaved by one man, a young king, a boy really, a boy who had been handed a weapon by heaven itself. His name was Solomon, son of David, son of Bathsheba, the third king of a united Israel. History remembers him as the wisest man who ever lived. The Bible calls him beloved of God, but the banned texts, the apocryphal scrolls, the forbidden pseudepigrapha, the grimoires locked in monastery vaults, they remember him as something else entirely. A sorcerer king, a summoner, a man who looked into the abyss and commanded it to kneel. This is not the Sunday school version of Solomon. This is the version the church tried to bury, the version that rabbinical authorities debated for centuries before sealing it away, the version that Islamic scholars preserved in their own traditions with reverence and with terror. This is the story of how a little king went searching for 72 friends and found them in the darkest corners of creation. To understand what Solomon became, you must first understand what he was. He was young, disturbingly young by the standards of kingship. Most ancient historians place him somewhere between 12 and 20 years of age when he took the throne of Israel, a throne soaked in blood. His father, King David, the giant killer, the warrior poet, the man after God's own heart, had spent his reign in perpetual warfare. He had united the 12 fractious tribes of Israel into a single kingdom by sheer force of will and bronze-edged violence. He had conquered Jerusalem itself, tearing it from the Jebusites, and declared it his eternal capital. But David was forbidden from building the temple. The house of God, the permanent dwelling for the Ark of the Covenant, would not be raised by hands stained with the blood of war. That sacred task would fall to his son, his chosen heir, not Absalom, the beautiful rebel who had tried to steal the kingdom,
not Adonijah, the eldest surviving prince who had already declared himself king, but Solomon, the quiet one, the thinker, Bathsheba's boy. The name itself is a clue. Shlomo, from the Hebrew shalom, peace. He was named for the thing his father never had. And yet, peace would not come easily. The Testament of Solomon, a Greek pseudo-epigraphical text likely composed between the 1st and 5th centuries of the Common Era, though many scholars believe it draws on far older oral traditions, opens not with Solomon's glory, but with suffering. The construction of the temple had begun. Solomon had gathered the finest artisans in the known world. Cedar logs floated down from Tyre, sent by his ally King Hiram of Phoenicia. Quarries were carved into the hills south of Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of laborers were conscripted in rotating shifts of forced labor, the Mass, as the Hebrew Bible calls it, a system so brutal it would eventually tear the kingdom apart. But among these workers there was one whom Solomon favored above all others. The text names him simply as the master workman's boy, a child, an apprentice to the head builder. Solomon loved this boy. The text is clear about that. This child was precious to the king, and something was killing him. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the western hills, the boy would begin to waste, his vitality drained, his wages, his sustenance were being consumed, not by thieves, not by disease, by something that came in the twilight hours and fed. The Testament describes the entity with chilling specificity. It did not merely steal from the boy, it fed on him. It sucked the life from his right thumb, a detail so oddly precise that scholars have debated its meaning for centuries. Some interpret it as a form of psychic vampirism. Others see it as a literal description of blood drinking, the thumb being a site of accessible veins in the ancient medical understanding. The Talmudic tradition has its own categories for such beings, the shadim, the lilin, the mazikin, creatures that operate in the liminal space between dusk and dawn. The boy grew thinner, paler. He could barely lift a chisel. And finally, in desperation, he went to Solomon. The king was devastated. Here was all his wisdom, all his God-given understanding of the natural world. The Book of Kings tells us Solomon could discourse on trees, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop growing in the wall, on beasts, birds, reptiles, and fish, and he could do nothing. So Solomon did what his father had always done when the world became too vast, too dark, too hostile. He prayed. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary scenes in all of apocryphal literature.
The archangel Michael, commander of the heavenly host, the same being who, according to the book of Daniel, stands guard over the nation of Israel, the same entity the book of Revelation describes as casting Satan from heaven, appeared before Solomon. And he brought a gift, a ring. Not a ring of gold or silver, not a ring adorned with earthly gems. The Testament describes it as a seal, a signet bearing an engraving, the pentalpha, the five-pointed star, what later traditions would call the Seal of Solomon, and what the medieval grimoires would depict as two interlocking triangles forming a hexagram, the Star of David. But in this earliest account, it was simpler. It was fire made solid, authority made physical,
the very power of God compressed into a band that could be worn on a human finger. Michael spoke, and his words, as recorded in the Testament, are staggeringly direct. "Take this ring, O Solomon, king, son of David, the gift which the Lord God, the highest Sabaoth, has sent to you. With it you shall lock up all the demons of the earth, both male and female, and with their help you shall build Jerusalem." Read that again. Let it settle. God did not send Solomon an army. He did not send him better tools or stronger workers or architectural blueprints. He sent him a weapon of binding, a ring that could enslave the very forces of darkness, and told him to use demons as his labor force. The theological implications are staggering, and they have haunted Jewish, Christian, and Islamic scholarship for millennia. Because this isn't just a story about construction, this is a story about cosmic authority. The idea that a mortal man, anointed by God, could be given dominion not merely over the nations of the earth, but over the principalities and powers of the unseen world. Solomon took the ring, and his first act was not of conquest or ambition. It was an act of love. He gave it to the boy. "Go," he told the apprentice, "when the demon comes to feed you tonight, throw this ring at its chest and say, 'In the name of God, King Solomon summons you.'" The boy obeyed, and that night, when the creature called Orneus, a shape-shifting entity the Testament describes as taking the form of a man, a lion, and a winged creature of fire, descended to feed, the boy did as Solomon commanded. He hurled the ring. It struck the demon's chest, and the seal burned into its flesh like a brand. Orneus screamed, and the scream, the Testament tells us, was heard across all Jerusalem. The boy dragged the entity before Solomon's throne. Orneus, bound, writhing, unable to flee, was the first demon to stand before the king. But he would not be the last, because Solomon did something that no exorcist, no priest, no prophet before him had ever done. He did not cast the demon out. He did not banish it to the wilderness or send it back to the abyss. He interrogated it. "Tell me," King said, leaning forward on his throne with those ancient knowing eyes, "who are you, and who is above you?" And Orneus, trembling, answered. He spoke of hierarchies, of princes, of thrones in the darkness. He spoke of a being far more powerful than himself, a king of demons, a prince of the air, whose name would echo through 3,000 years of occult tradition, Asmodeus. Solomon smiled. He had his first prisoner, and from this one, chained and broken, he would extract the names, the weaknesses, and the binding words for every dark prince in creation. The hunt had begun. What Solomon had learned from Orneus changed everything. The first demon had broken. Under the weight of the divine seal, under the searing authority of the ring forged in heaven, Orneus had not merely surrendered, he had talked. And what he revealed was a map of the invisible world, a hierarchy of darkness as structured and ordered as any earthly kingdom, with princes, governors, legions, and thrones. And Solomon, the wisest man alive, recognized immediately what he was looking at. This was not chaos. This was a government, an infernal bureaucracy, And like any bureaucracy, it could be infiltrated, dismantled, and conquered, one name at a time. The Testament of Solomon records what happened next in a format that reads less like scripture and more like an interrogation transcript. It is clinical, methodical, almost bureaucratic in its own right. Demon after demon is summoned before Solomon's throne, dragged in by previously bound entities or called forth by the power of the ring, and each undergoes the same ritual. Solomon asks, "Who are you?" Solomon asks, "What is your function? What do you do to humanity?" Solomon asks, "What angel opposes you? What name binds you?" And they answer. Every single one of them answers, because the ring, the seal of Solomon, carries the authority of God himself, and before that authority, even the princes of hell cannot lie. Let us walk through the interrogations as the Testament records them, because they are among the most disturbing and fascinating passages in all of ancient literature. After Ornius came Beelzebul, not Beelzebub, the lord of the flies that the New Testament references, but Beelzebul, a name meaning Lord of the High Place, or in some translations, Lord of the Dwelling. The Testament identifies him as the Prince of Demons, the highest-ranking fallen angel still active on earth, the former first angel of the first heaven who fell with the great rebellion and now rules the spirits trapped between the earth and the firmament. And Solomon summoned him, and the entity that appeared was unlike Ornius. There was no cowering, no trembling. Beelzebul arrived with arrogance. The text describes him as appearing bound in chains, but raging, threatening Solomon, boasting of his power, claiming dominion over all the nations that practiced idolatry. But when Solomon pressed the seal to his flesh, Beelzebul screamed, and then he spoke. He told Solomon everything: the structure of the demonic realm, the names of the ruling spirits, their functions, their weaknesses, their astrological correspondences, which constellation each demon was bound to, which star governed their power. He told Solomon about the spirits that cause disease, the spirits that destroy marriages, the spirits that drive men to war, the spirits that whisper blasphemy to the ears of the faithful at prayer. And Solomon wrote it all down. What follows in the Testament is a catalogue of darkness. Scholar after scholar, from D.C. Dooling's translation for the Old Testament pseudepigraph to the studies of Pablo Torriano, have noted that the text reads like a grimoire before grimoires existed. It is, in many ways, the original demonological manual. Let us meet some of the 72. Onoskelis. She appeared to Solomon as a woman of extraordinary beauty, fair-skinned, with the legs of a mule. She told the king that she was born from an echo, a voice in an unexpected place, a sound without a source. She told her that she lived in caves and ravines, and that her purpose was to pervert men, to strangle them in their sleep, and to lead travelers off cliffs in the darkness. Solomon bound her to spinning flax for the temple day and night.
Asmodeus, the king of demons, the destroyer of marriages. The text tells us he appeared before Solomon in a fury, the most defiant of all the bound spirits. He told Solomon that he was born of a human mother and an angel father, making him a Nephilim, one of the giants of old, the offspring of the forbidden union described in Genesis chapter 6. He told Solomon that his star was the constellation called the Wain, Ursa Major, the Great Bear,
and that his purpose was to plot against newlyweds, to sow discord between lovers, to drive young men to madness through lust, and to commit murder through jealousy. When Solomon asked what could bind him, Asmodeus laughed and said only the archangel Raphael, combined with the smoke of a burning liver and gall of a fish, a detail that matches almost exactly the story in the book of Tobit, where the young Tobias defeats Asmodeus using precisely this method to save his bride Sarah, whom the demon had killed 7 husbands of on their wedding nights. Solomon set Asmodeus to work. The most powerful demon in creation was chained to twisting ropes and carrying water jars for the masons. The list continues, each entity more disturbing than the last. The 7 sisters, female spirits who called themselves the Pleiades, named for the star cluster, who told Solomon they lived in darkness and caused diseases of the throat, infections of the flesh, and trances, what modern scholars have interpreted as epileptic seizures. Lix Tetrax, the demon of the whirlwind, who told Solomon that he set fields on fire in summer, caused shipwrecks, and hurled rocks through the air. Solomon bound him to hurl stones up to the heights of the temple, using the demon's own destructive power as a construction crane. The headless entity called Murder, who simply said, "I am called Murder because I devour heads, but I desire a head, for I have none, and I have attached myself to this form." Solomon bound it to a furnace. Envy, strife, discord, deception, power, error, each demon a personification, each entity a function, each name a weapon. Because that was the secret, the names. In the ancient Near Eastern world, across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Canaan, and Israel, to know the true name of a being was to have power over it. This was not metaphor, this was ontological reality. A name was identity, a name was essence. When God gave Adam the authority to name the animals in Eden, he was giving Adam dominion over them. When God revealed his own name to Moses at the burning bush, the Tetragrammaton, Yod-Wah, he was entering into a covenant of terrifying intimacy. Solomon understood this. Every interrogation was an act of war. Every name extracted was a chain forged. And by the time he was done, he had bound 72 of the most powerful entities in the demonic hierarchy. 72. That number is not accidental. In Jewish angelology, there are 72 names of God, derived from 3 verses in Exodus chapter 14, each containing 72 Hebrew letters. There are 72 nations in the Table of Nations in Genesis chapter 10. The Sanhedrin, the great court of Israel, consisted of 72 elders. The number represents totality, completeness, universal dominion. Solomon had not merely captured a few rogue spirits, he had conquered the entire infernal government, every prince, every governor, every power. And with their enslaved labor, the impossible was accomplished. The first temple rose in 7 years, 180 feet long, 90 feet wide, 54 feet tall. Its walls were lined with cedar carved in the shapes of gourds, open flowers, and palm trees. Its floors were covered in gold. The Holy of Holies, the inner chamber where God's presence would dwell, was a perfect cube, 30 feet in every dimension, overlaid with 600 talents of gold. No hammer heard, no chisel ringing, no iron, because the workers were not human. and the king who commanded them was no longer merely a man. He was something the world had never seen before and would never see again, a mortal with the authority of angels, a man who had looked into the abyss, called it by name, and made it carry his stones. But, as every ancient text warns, as every story of forbidden power teaches, the abyss does not forget, it does not forgive, and it is infinitely, endlessly patient.
Word traveled. In the ancient world, news moved at the speed of trade routes, along the incense road from southern Arabia, up through the Hejaz, across the Negev, and into the hill country of Judah. Merchants carried it. Sailors whispered it in the ports of Ezion-Geber on the Red Sea. Diplomats murmured it in the courts of Egypt and Tyre and Babylon. There was a king in Jerusalem, a young king, and the things they said about him strained the boundaries of belief. They said he could speak to animals, that birds reported to him. The hoopoe, according to Islamic tradition, served as his personal scout and messenger. They said he understood the language of ants, that he could command the wind, that he built a throne so magnificent it moved by itself, carried by spirits bound to its legs. They said he knew the names of things that had no names in any human tongue. And they said he was building a temple that defied the laws of nature. Among those who heard these reports was a monarch of equal ambition and far greater skepticism. She ruled a kingdom at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, a land the Hebrews called Sheba, the Arabs called Saba, and modern archaeology has confirmed as one of the wealthiest civilizations of the ancient world. The Queen of Sheba. Her historical existence is one of the most debated questions in biblical archaeology. The Hebrew Bible mentions her in 1 Kings chapter 10 and 2 Chronicles chapter 9. The Quran references her in Surah An-Naml, the chapter of the ants. Ethiopian tradition, the Kebra Nagast, the glory of the kings, makes her the central figure in the founding myth of their entire civilization. And archaeology, while cautious, has not dismissed her. The kingdom of Saba was real, devastatingly real. Excavations at Marib in modern-day Yemen, led by teams including the American Foundation for the Study of Man and later German archaeologists under Burkhard Vogt, uncovered a civilization of staggering sophistication. The Great Dam of Marib, one of the engineering wonders of the ancient world, irrigated over 25,000 acres of desert, feeding a population of roughly 50,000 people in the middle of one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth. The Sabaeans controlled the incense trade, frankincense and myrrh, the two most valuable commodities in the ancient world after gold. These resins, harvested from the boswellia and comifera trees that grew only in southern Arabia and the Horn of Africa, were essential to every temple, every funeral, every royal court from Rome to Persepolis. The Sabaeans sat on a monopoly worth, in modern terms, billions. So when the Bible tells us that the Queen of Sheba arrived in Jerusalem with camels bearing spices, gold, and precious stones, 120 talents of gold by the biblical account, roughly 4.5 tons, this is not fantasy. This is geopolitically plausible. This is what a state visit from the ruler of the incense monopoly would actually look like. But she did not come to pay tribute. She came to test him. The Book of Kings tells us she came to test him with hard questions. The Hebrew word is chidot, riddles, enigmas, puzzles designed not merely to measure intelligence, but to probe the boundaries of wisdom itself. The Talmud elaborates extensively.
The Midrash Mishlei and the Targum Sheni to the Book of Esther provide lists of her riddles, though scholars debate which are original and which are later additions. They include questions about the nature of God, about the distinction between men and women disguised in identical clothing, about water that comes neither from the earth nor from the sky, logic puzzles, theological paradoxes, tests of perception. Solomon answered every one. But the true test was not the riddles, it was the tour. The Book of Kings describes what the queen saw, and the text itself seems breathless, as if the ancient author could barely keep pace with the spectacle. She saw the house he had built, the palace complex that took 13 years to construct, even longer than the temple. She saw the food of his table, the seating of his officials, the attendance of his servants and their clothing, his cupbearers and their attire, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple. And the text says, in one of the most emotionally raw lines in the entire Hebrew Bible, "There was no more spirit in her."
The Hebrew is telling. The word for spirit here is ruach, breath, wind, spirit, life force. The Queen of Sheba, ruler of the incense empire, a woman accustomed to wealth beyond imagination, looked at what Solomon had built, and it knocked the breath from her lungs. "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true," she said, "but I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth, you have far exceeded the report I heard." But what did she really see? Because the canonical text tells us about the gold and the servants and the food, but the apocryphal traditions tell us about what was beneath the surface, what the queen saw that the Bible dared not record. The Islamic tradition, preserved in the works of scholars like al-Tabari and al-Thalabi, tells us a remarkable story. When the queen approached Solomon's palace, she encountered a floor made of crystal, transparent glass laid over flowing water, so perfectly clear that it appeared to be a pool. The queen, believing she was about to step into water, lifted her skirts to wade through, and in doing so, revealed her legs. This detail has been interpreted in 1,000 ways. Some scholars see it as a test of perception, Solomon demonstrating that appearances deceive, that the real world is not the seen world. Others see it as a display of supernatural engineering, a floor built not by human hands, but by the jinn, the bound spirits, working crystal and water into an architectural impossibility. The Ethiopian Kebra Nagast goes further still. It tells us that the queen, called Makeda in the Ethiopian tradition, was not merely impressed by Solomon, she was seduced by him. Not by charm or beauty, but by the sheer gravitational force of his wisdom and power. She stayed in Jerusalem for months. She converted to the worship of the God of Israel, and she conceived a child, Menelik I, who would become the first emperor of Ethiopia, founding a dynasty that claimed an unbroken 3,000-year lineage that lasted until Emperor Haile Selassie was deposed in 1974. Whether this is historical fact or national mythology is debated, but what is not debated is this: the story of the Queen of Sheba's visit, in every tradition that preserves it, is a story about the most powerful woman in the ancient world being overwhelmed by the most powerful man. It is a story about human power reaching its absolute zenith. And it is precisely at this zenith that the ancient stories begin to curdle. Because the Book of Kings tells us something else about Solomon, something it mentions almost casually, tucked between the accounts of his wealth and his wisdom, as if the author hoped we might not notice. King Solomon loved many foreign women,
Moabite women, Ammonite women, Edomite women, Sidonian women, Hittite women. 700 wives, 300 concubines, 1,000 women from the nations that God had explicitly told the Israelites not to intermarry with, for surely they will turn your hearts after their gods. The wisest man who ever lived heard the warning, and he ignored it. The great deception was never the crystal floor. It was never the riddles or the gold or the impossible temple. The great deception was this, that a man who could bind the princes of hell could not bind his own heart.
It happened slowly. That is what makes it so terrifying. It did not happen in a single night of madness. There was no dramatic fall, no thunderbolt from heaven, no moment where Solomon woke up and chose darkness. The Book of Kings is very specific about the timeline. It uses a single devastating phrase. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. As he grew old. Not as a young man drunk on power, not at the height of his supernatural authority when the ring blazed and the demons cowered, but later, in the quiet years, when the temple was complete and the quarries were silent and the 72 were sealed away and there was nothing left to conquer. That is when it happened. To understand what Solomon fell into, you must understand what these women brought with them. This was not mere cultural exchange. This was not the harmless sharing of customs between a cosmopolitan king and his international court. Each of these women was in a very real sense a diplomatic emissary of her nation's gods. Marriage alliances in the ancient Near East were religious as well as political. When Solomon married the daughter of Pharaoh, his most prestigious match, mentioned prominently in the Book of Kings, he was entering into a covenant not merely with Egypt, but with the entire Egyptian pantheon. When he married Sidonian women, he was opening a door to Baal and Astarte. When he married Ammonite women, he was welcoming Milcom, also known as Moloch. Moloch. The name itself has become synonymous with the darkest aspects of ancient religion. Classical sources, Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, Tertullian, describe the worship of Moloch in terms that read like horror fiction, but are corroborated by centuries of archaeological evidence. The cult of Moloch, and here we must be precise because the historical record is complex and still debated, involved the practice of child sacrifice. The Hebrew term is molech or molech, and whether it refers to a specific deity or to a type of sacrificial offering is still argued by scholars like George C. Hyder and John Day, but the biblical text is unequivocal about the practice itself. Leviticus chapter 18 prohibits it explicitly. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Moloch. The phrasing in Hebrew, lehavir, means literally to pass through, and is understood to mean passing a child through fire. Archaeological excavations at Carthage, the Phoenician colony in North Africa, uncovered the Tophet, a sacred precinct containing thousands of urns with the cremated remains of infants and young children. The inscriptions on the stelae above them describe the offerings as Molech sacrifices. The debate about whether these were sacrificed children or children who died naturally and were cremated continues, but the sheer scale of the Tophet and its correspondence with the literary sources has led most scholars to accept that ritual child sacrifice was practiced in the Phoenician Canaanite religious sphere. And Solomon built a high place for it. On the Mount of Olives, directly across the Kidron Valley from the temple of the Lord. Feel the geography of it.
Feel the horror of it. The temple, the house of the living God, built by the labor of enslaved demons, financed by the wealth of the earth's mightiest empire, consecrated with the prayers of a man who had spoken face to face with archangels, stood on Mount Moriah. And directly across the valley, close enough to see from the temple's eastern windows, Solomon erected altars to Astarte, the goddess of the Sidonians, the queen of heaven, a fertility deity whose worship involved ritual prostitution. He built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, a war god whose cult demanded the blood of enemies, and in extremis, the king's own firstborn son, as recorded in 2 Kings chapter 3, when King Mesha of Moab sacrificed his heir on the city walls. And he built a high place for Moloch, the devourer, the furnace god, the bronze-bellied idol into whose flames the children of Ammon were laid. The man who had been given the ring of heaven now burned incense to the gods of the abyss. The man who chained Asmodeus now worshipped alongside priestesses of Astarte. The man who interrogated demons and extracted their names now whispered the names of foreign gods in prayer. The Testament of Solomon records the moment of his fall with devastating simplicity. A Jebusite woman, one of his many wives, asked him to make an offering to her gods. Just one, a small thing, 5 grasshoppers offered to the gods Raphan and Moloch. Solomon refused at first, but she persisted, and finally, to please her, to keep the peace of his own household, to satisfy the woman sharing his bed, he agreed. And the glory of God departed from him. The text says, "My spirit was darkened, and I became a laughingstock to the idols and to the demons."
The theological weight of this sentence is almost unbearable. The man who had dominated the unseen world, who had stood as God's appointed viceroy over angels and demons alike, became their mockery. The 72 he had chained, they laughed. The entities he had forced to carry stones and twist ropes and hurl boulders, they laughed. The abyss had been patient, and the abyss had won. God's response, as recorded in 1 Kings chapter 11, was the dismantling of everything Solomon had built. Not immediately. God waited until Solomon's death, out of respect for David, his father. But the sentence was pronounced. "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." And so it happened. Solomon died around 931 BCE. His son Rehoboam, arrogant, foolish, the opposite of everything Solomon had been, took the throne and immediately provoked a civil war. The 10 northern tribes seceded under Jeroboam, a former official of Solomon's court. The United Kingdom of Israel, David's masterwork, Solomon's inheritance, shattered like a clay vessel. It would never be reunited. But the story does not end with Solomon's death. In many ways, it was only beginning, because Solomon's legacy, the bound demons, the signet ring, the interrogation transcripts, the names of power, became the foundation of an entire tradition of Western occultism that stretches unbroken from the ancient world to the present day. The medieval grimoires, the Key of Solomon, the Lemegeton, the Sworn Book of Honorius, the Heptameron, all claim Solomonic authorship or Solomonic authority. They present themselves not as works of dark magic, but as manuals for righteous men to command demons in God's name, just as Solomon did. The most famous of these is the Ars Goetia,
the first book of the Lemegeton, or Lesser Key of Solomon, compiled in the 17th century from much older sources. It lists exactly 72 demons, each with a name, each with a rank: king, duke, prince, marquis, count, president, each with a seal, a specific symbol that must be drawn to summon and bind them, each with a description of their appearance and their powers. 72, the same number, the same hierarchy, the same claim of Solomonic authority. Scholars like Owen Davies, author of Grimoires, A History of Magic Books, and Joseph Peterson, who has published critical editions of many of these texts, have traced the lineage directly. The Ars Goetia is the descendant, distorted, elaborated, filtered through centuries of Christian demonology and Islamic jinn lore and Renaissance ceremonial magic, of the tradition that began with the Testament of Solomon. The names changed. Orias became Orius, Beelzebul became Baal. Asmodeus kept his name across 3,000 years, but the system endured, the principle endured. The terrifying idea that a mortal could, with the right authority and the right names, command the powers of darkness, that idea never died. It is still practiced today. The Golden Dawn in the 19th century, Aleister Crowley's invocations in the 20th, the modern chaos magic movement, the online grimoire communities. Every occult bookstore in every city in the Western world carries some version of the Key of Solomon. They are all, every last one of them, reaching back through time to a young king in Jerusalem who held a burning ring and asked the darkness its name. Solomon sought 72 friends. He found them in the darkness, chained them with the power of heaven, and used them to build the most sacred structure in human history. And then he burnt incense to their masters. The wisest man who ever lived left behind a temple that would be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar in 582 BCE, a kingdom that would fracture before his body was cold, a legacy of wisdom preserved in Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, and a legacy of darkness preserved in grimoires and occult manuals. He was, in the end, a warning. The same warning that every ancient text, every sacred tradition, every mythology on earth has tried to teach us. That power without restraint becomes its own prison. That wisdom without humility becomes its own madness. And that the line between commanding the darkness and serving it is thinner than a ring of gold on a king's finger.